this evening, so I'm going to make it the most. Evolution Hour 116 Bats in Jeanson's Belfry and Geyer Dreamtime soft issue. As you know, replacing Darwin has been the obsession of my life. Not really. But we're trying to go through to do something which Jeanson didn't supply, which is a bibliography of the sources he uses and where he uses them, what he does. Pretty much we've exhausted the amount of sources he cited because we're getting down to the end of the book and we're into this chapter where he has an absolutely, you may be seeing our wonderful patrons who are keeping this program alive and keeping the RJ out of more trouble than he would normally be in if we weren't doing all that. Thank you ever so many people for helping out on the project. I literally could not do it without you. Anyway, now we got a thing where we can actually show you what's going on in here. Boop, 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 boop. Bats, or at least a little bit of bats, because it's only one family, which, by the way, Jackson, Wheat, and I discussed in The Rocks Were There, Volume 1, in relation to how Todd Wood, I believe, had screwed up his discussion of bats quite a few years ago, missing huge amounts of biogeography and so forth and so on. You want to guess whether Janson's done any better? Well, fortunately, he didn't. He actually inadvertently cited a work on bats in the work. Oh, hi, Scott. There it's yes, it is indeed a rare pleasure to catch the old Gipper live. I've got beautiful full 100% signal coming through for the moment, so we'll cross fingers and we'll get what we got. I'll also make a reference to what's going on because it's a tiny short thing for the part 2 part. There's a piece on the Australian Dreamtime by Peter Geyer, who's a new name on the creationism block. He hasn't seen any stuff, so I presume he'll probably be repeating more blather later down the road. But anyway, he brings up soft tissue in a completely unrelated topic, which is a side swipe about the dream time of the Australians and how supposedly this is reflective of kind of something that might be connected up to Genesis. We'll see about that little part. But the point is that just like last week, when Cox waved genetic entropy, which ain't a thing, this is soft tissue. The soft tissue issue, how I love saying that, the soft tissue issue, is not quite what they deal with. And Jackson and I are going to be having a big section in Rocks Were There, Volume 2, going into the various papers and the discussion, all of this, and then leading up, of course, to Armitage and his Triceratops horn tissue. So that's all going to be really big fun. You can thank Insomnia for the privilege. Yeah. I don't know what time zone everybody is all in. I know Ian Chen down in Australia is often popping in and around this time and that as well. So we may be seeing him as well because it's like morning over there, as it goes. Anyway, so the bats, the Vespertilionidae, there are about 20 families of bats, which by and large creationists don't pay a hell of a lot of attention to. And this particular group, Jeanson actually bumped into because of a paper by Miller Butterworth in 2007 that he went into a couple hundred pages earlier, and I would have alluded to it when we previously did that. And it involved a single group within that family, only a couple species of the long-fingered Miniopterus bats. And Jeanson didn't actually discuss any of the contents of that paper. He just dangled it in front of it. And so he particularly did not delve into the conclusion that they had offered on this. And I'll be putting the quote up in the main section. But anyway, I will read it to you. We estimate that they diverged from all of the bat species approximately 49 to 38 million years ago, which is comparable to most other bat families. Oh ho. Furthermore, we find very strong support from all phylogenetic methods for a sister group relationship between the Miniopteridae and the Vespertilionidae. The Molossidae, now I hate all of these bat names, diverged from these lineages approximately 54 to 43 million years ago and form a sister group to the Miniopteridae, Vespertilionidae clade. So he's scrunching, in principle, this couple species of bats. But the point is, he's not talking about a couple species of bats. He's talking about this whole family, which actually has hundreds of species of bats. And although and he may have picked on them for the same reason that Wood did, because their relationships were kind of unclear in the pre-genetic analysis level for about 100 years. But a paper from 2010, 7 years before this book was published, by Roars, which we'll be putting a link into, had clarified the systematics on that quite a great deal. So we got 240 species of bats in the family that he brings up and for which he cited no technical literature. How many little dots does he have on his little chart? Yeah, about 2 dozen. Of which he has most of them materializing within about 750 years after the flood, and thus by about 1600. Better. Yes, there we go. Yes, better get a head start on the hyperevolution post-flood. Maybe this single female bat on the ark was pregnant with the genetic information that's going to lead not only to the bats in the 240 species, but managed to spread all over the New World. Lickety split. The 2 little bat kinds coming to America, and then breeding like rabbits rather than bats in the New World and becoming highly specialized, as we discussed in Volume 1. Some of these things are connected up with very specialized cacti connections, and the others that don't make any sense from trying to compress them into that amount of time frame. So anyway, we've got Jeanson plainly leaving out most of the data field and not ever even coming anywhere close to trying to figure out what the biogeography of these little things flipping off of Noah's Ark there somewhere in the Ararat-ish region. Remember, in this entire book, he's not coming clean about the details. We don't actually have a functional model of all of this. Pollinated then. Oh, yes. That's another little fun part we have in the post-flood world. Some of the John Morris, the geologist son of Henry Morris, had a bit that I've been going through all the back issues of Acts and Facts to get them collated for the new book. Some of which relates to cosmology issues, and some of it relates to soft tissue and various systematic elements in that. So it's fun. But anyway, at one point, I think around 2013-ish, Morris is talking about how serious and severe the flood was, and then he was thinking that there would be like baby dinosaurs on board the ark. That's a fairly common trope that you pop up in there, and so they've even bought a hadrosaur fossil for their creation museum down there in Texas or somewhere that they built up. This is different from the Ken Ham one over in Arkansas, wherever the hell all that is, Kansas. Anyway, he then states about how even though they're little juvenile hadrosaurs, they're going to be really hungry ones when they come off of the ark. At which point I'm going, and where exactly is he getting the food for them? In the flood-blasted, cataclysmic, bleak, desolate, rotting flesh of all the critters on the planet, anomalocarids and trilobites and saber-toothed tigers and all the dinosaurs and the therapsids, and my gosh, it's a mucky mess, and the bacteria and all of the stuff that's going on in there as well. There was a hilarious video that Erica Gibbon put out about a year or so ago. We'll be referencing it in the new book, of course, about what the critters are supposed to, how much bacteria there had to have been in the pre-flood world. And in fact, that was one of the points that Erica was making, that is a dead giveaway that we got a big problem. Oh, and, oh yes, Benjamin Simpson, another Aussie here. I will, for all of you from down under, I will do a pathetic, shameless plug. Oops, I forgot where my little thing is. That the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg 2 has some wonderful visits to Australia in the year 1873, which figures in the story and the mysterious thing that's going on outside of Melbourne on all of that private property. So if you want to have a zing for some fiction, and then of course I've also come up with a fresh edition of the first book with all the little typographical errors and stuff that had been in, because that was my very first effort in the publication biz, and I've resolved around that. And we're hot at work on volume 3, in addition to the second Rocks Were There book. So no one can ever accuse me of being unoccupied in my retirement. And again, I thank all of the patrons on the project and all the people that keep spreading the word around on all this. I put up on Twitter also, there was a creation conference that was popping, not a conference, a lecture. Randy Gugliuzza and Tim Clary and Frank Sherwin slipped into town and were at a church here in Spokane for a weekend creation show, which costs money to go to, so I know. But fortunately, they've got tons of articles up, and gosh, I seem to think that we've criticized every single one of those in our various books already. So anyway, at Spokane Faves, that I'm the resident atheist there in the Spokane Faiths and Values group, I was asked would I like to have a comment on it, because I seem to know an awful lot about this creationism thing, and I said, sure. So I did a couple-page short thing pointing out how they were inflating their credentials. Everybody has talked about the doctor. Gugliuzza is a medical doctor. Clary is the only one with an actual doctorate, geology one, and he ought to ask for his tuition back, because boy, has a mess there. And Sherwin has only an honorary doctorate in creation science from a religious college. Every one of them has mucked up some stuff. So I allude to the thing that Joel Duff has made a big point about, which is the schism that's taken place because Gugliuzza is just keen on natural selection not being a thing. And he has this weird, wacky alternative that of course, regular biologists don't pay any attention to it at all. But even some creationists are pissed off about this. In fact, Jason Lyle has left the ICR over this issue because he thinks it's absolute claptrap, that they've just disconnected themselves from any untethered. And coming from Jason Lyle, that's an awkward problem. And then there was a bit that I gave a little preface to, because I've been planning on criticizing Sherwin later on in this month on this show. So we'll get to that on Halloween. Then I also put in a link in that discussion to Joel Duff's pointing out about Gugliuzza's material. And then I also put a link in for Tim Clary, the criticism I did a couple of years ago now on the cold slab issue, because it was a perfect characterization of how this guy manipulates and misrepresents source material. I was giving my review of the protagonists, even though I wasn't seeing the actual presentation they did, although all the topics were familiar. They were going to be discussing dinosaurs. They were going to be discussing Mount St. Helens. Gugliuzza, who really I think is only doing one presentation, is probably going to be throwing out his continuous environmental tracking alternative to natural selection. And probably none of them will be mentioning the various criticisms and problems. Oh, another thing that's wacky about Clary is that he's in that group. Also, Joel Duff has been pointing this out. Clary is in a little small niche at the ICR that's trying to pull the flood boundary down into the Cenozoic. Now, you can see, if you know about how geology works and all that, there's no differentiation between how rocks are formed 1 billion years ago and 300 million years ago and 50 million years ago. But in the creation structure, The billion-year-old stuff would be creation week rock. And then the 500 million or 300 million year old stuff is flood deposit, ending with the Cretaceous pretty much. And then the post-Cretaceous is taking place afterwards. Maybe some sloshy mini sloshes stuff because the Ice Age is coming along and all that in like a couple hundred years after the flood. This is their model. But geologically, there are Lagerstätten deposits. The Green River has some spectacularly preserved fish fossils and the like that. How could they not have been formed in the flood if the only way that can form is in a flood? So there's a certain temptation that they have to drag that stuff down and push that boundary farther and farther along. There are enough people in the creationist community who have problems with every one of those chains as to when the flood supposedly begins and when the flood supposedly ends, that there's no consensus on that. And it's purely arbitrary as to what they feel like fiddling with. But anyway, Clary's in this little bunch of maybe about a half dozen or less people who are pushing for this late into the Cenozoic model, and we'll sit back and watch, or rather probably watch Joel Duff watch the continual process on that. And meanwhile, over in the geological community, they're not paying any attention to any of this. And for the same reason, they're not paying attention to Gulius's natural selection notions or Tompkins and Jeanson and all the little charts and stuff they come up with and playing around with the genetics. So anyway, that's going to be all coverage that we'll be dealing with in the new book. Because of the probably about another year to write the thing through, we'll both want to be keeping up with all of the anti-evolution material that we can that's relevant to the points that we're bringing up, as well as a reprise chapter, which will be doing updates on the stuff that was in volume 1. Oh, 3:30 in the morning here. Whee! Yeah, well, it's almost that. It's just past midnight in here. We're still doing fine on our little featurette there, our number of bands. We're going okay on it. It's a wonderful opportunity. One thing I can, again, remind everybody of, that for those who have any criticism of any branch of creationism, if it's a specialty that you've been fascinated by, dive into it and do some videos, or if you have a website or a podcast or anything else, draw it in. And always, if you do so, try to do the same thing that I'm doing, which is to put up links to full text whenever possible. In fact, I don't particularly go overboard in videos to put links to just abstracts. The main point is I kind of want to home in on the fact that if you can see the full text of the creationist and the full text of the paper they just cited, you can compare those two yourself. And in virtually every case, you'll find that the technical science paper is revealing really interesting stuff, and you learn stuff. Whereas the creationist post is all tunnel vision, that they don't really explain fairly what the facts are. They don't deal with most of the facts. They don't really apply their model. They may not even know what their model is, or they don't talk about the other models in the creationist community that they disagree with, which was the point of the posting that I did about the ICR meet. There are quite a lot of disputed issues within creationism, but when you get to the surface apologetics, whether it's at ICR, AIG, or CMI, or the various little ancillary bumps that you find in the internet that follow them, Kent Hovind is in a planet all himself, because basically he's riffing off of Walt Brown and material that's often decades out of date. And quite a few creationists are in that mode. But the apologetics that you get at those major magazines don't want to give the impression that there's any disagreements in their community. They're not upfront about it. And it's only if you burrow down into the footnotes and into the little sidebars, and usually you have to go all the way over into their technical journals, the Answers Research Journal, Journal of Creation, things like that. That's where there'll be infighting going on, where you'll actually be able to see that. And you also get some of that in the Creation Research Society Quarterly and that sort of stuff. So it's a thing that anybody can dive into. And I have a polymathic interest, but I'm not a scientist. I have a historian's degree. And just a little lowly BA in history at that. But that does mean that I can be familiar and comfortable flitting around in the source department. And I think the more people that get into this, so many people that I've seen online have basically seated the pants into the very same procedure. So when Joel Duff goes down and looks at people's source citations, when Paula Gia does that with creationists, when Dapper Dino does that, Digital Hammurabi, when he's talking about misinterpretations of biblical texts and Babylonian mythology and other subjects, they're all functionally doing source methods, which is, okay, here's what the facts are, and here's what they're saying about the facts, and they're getting that part wrong. And then they're citing this person over here who doesn't actually say what they claim, or is outdated, or they shouldn't have really relied on that because that's been superseded even in their own work by such and so, and all that. You get all of those aspects of things. And it's a fun procedure to do. There's few things more exhilarating than to see somebody visibly screwing up in front of you. And you can see them do that in the source citation level. And there's something else important about it. It's objective. We're way below the upper echelon world. Yes, it's funny, I see creation, evolution, flat earth physics. Yes, even though by and large, flat earthers will be very conservative creationists, biblical creationists. There are possibly a few exceptions, but boy, it's tough to find them. They're a tiny little niche. A somewhat bigger niche are the geocentric biblical creationist young earthers. And then, of course, the much bigger niche of the young earth creationists entirely. But from a source methods point of view, no, there ain't a dime's worth of difference between them. That they have a preconceived dogma that must be true no matter what. They scavenge around for sources that agree with them. They make apologetic twists and turns and present things that to them maybe sound entirely convincing, and to a lot of the people that watch them or read their works will sound convincing. And they don't really deal with the full body of things or criticism that's been leveled of it, or work out a predictive model, look for a flat earther trying to explain celestial motion predictively the way regular cosmology can. Never going to happen. Maps of what the earth looks like. How come the ice wall? How could that work? Any of that stuff. It's indistinguishable, frankly, from you get in young earth creationism. And in this second book, where the geology and biological material that we were presenting so much in the first work, the second book is going to have big sectors on flood geology as applied to history and mythology. So the discussion of, gosh, were there living dinosaurs in Africa? And have people been painting pictures of dinosaurs in the Middle Ages and doing tapestries of them? Did Leonardo da Vinci see a dragon that he physically drew a picture of? I'm not making any of this stuff up. There are actually arguments within the young earth creationist community, and they are at both CMI, AIG, and ICR, and hangers around. And there's a lot of, again, infighting as to which things they're okay with and which they aren't. So some will be dismissive of the Paluxy River man-track arguments. Others will still be embracing them. Don Batten, for example. And then you get into some real hilarious things over the NAMI affair, which is this bunch of Korean creationists and their buddies who think they found the Noah's Ark in an ice crevasse, and it looks like it's faked up movie set fraud. And you get Don Batten saying it's a fraud. You get Andrew Snelling claiming it's a fraud. It's absolutely hilarious. Oh, yeah, we got... it's only because they're relatively new to it. The arguments haven't changed in years. Yeah, the overall superstructure of creationism not only hasn't changed in years, it hasn't changed since Darwin's time. If you read the kinds of criticisms that St. George Mivart was making, and it's available for download online, I think, the book he wrote in the 1870s, he was kind of a lapsed Roman Catholic that got excommunicated because there was too much evolution in his view for the Catholic Church. But he didn't like, he sounds an awful lot like intelligent design apologetics, frankly, if you read the book on it. But apart from the little fiddly bit ins and outs of things, the basic picture, of course, in all of anti-evolutionism, human beings have to be specially created. Bingo. Creation of the universe has to be God's doing, and life also. These are the same issues that would have been intriguing to Alfred Wallace when he got in his spiritualist phase. And so the origin of life and the origin of mind and consciousness were things for him, to where modern intelligent design advocates try to hijack him over to the intelligent design side, even though he was a great believer in the primacy of natural selection throughout all of the natural world. In fact, more of a natural selectionist than Darwin was. Darwin, and he had some tussles because Darwin proposed also sexual selection, and Wallace didn't like that at all. And so we discussed some of that in the other book, and I also have alluded to that in Evolution Slam Dunk. But the benchmarks bits, the things and because we're going to be having a section on human evolution in the new book in graver detail, we alluded to bits and pieces of it in the first volume, but we'll have a much larger section covering the creationist approach to human evolution. That's the big bugbear for all anti-evolutionists, that historically speaking, theoretically, an anti-evolutionist could accept a lot of evolution, provided human beings were kept separate from the mixture. And I think some people who ended up kind of quasists in the time of Darwin and Wallace could pull that trick off, so long as humans were separate. And the fossil record, when basically all you had were Neanderthals, which maybe they were deformed Napoleon soldiers or something. You know, they could find ways to rationalize it because there weren't a hell of a lot of fossil data. You were just getting little bits in the 1890s with Dubois, which what we would now call Homo erectus fossils in Asia. But after World War I, when people started to investigate more of the African fossil record, and especially after World War II, when now the paleoanthropologists really started going into it in a vengeance, and and the genetic information started to come along that connects up with the primates, and the developmental biology is known even more sophisticated now, that after World War II, it's virtually impossible to make any argument to separate human beings from every other evolution. So they got to go all or nothing. And that means that the modern anti-evolution movement then becomes absolutely extreme in that they can't let any amount of evolution into the door. And that's why you get this problem with natural selection and the issue of speciation as to, well, if you can have a species and another species, and all of that can happen really, really fast after the flood, can it spill over into another kind? Well, if you don't look at the kinds too closely and you leave out most of the species, like Jeanson did with the bats, bingo, you can draw those rigid boundaries. And so we'll also be going into that aspect in the appendix on the new book, which will relate to the Ark Encounter's list of kinds. At last, a list of kinds, a specific, even as it is, it's only the kinds on the Ark. And so it's not even a list. They don't talk about fish and all of that were living in the sea and therefore didn't have a problem. Never mind what the salinity level of the oceans would have been or not during the flood cataclysm that was all going on. So all of that is going to be really fun. And then we're going to be talking about parasites. We're going to be talking about all the little diseases and the theodicy issue. We're going to be talking about Chinese mythology. There's an awful lot going on in here. Oh, yes, that helped a lot. One, paleontology hadn't got far enough to recognize the difference between minor morphological changes that were not present. Yeah. Factor two is that until the times when homeobox genes and developmental biology and the mechanisms of how digits develop in limbs in relation, for example, to the origin of tetrapods and the brain structures that are going on in hominids, if you didn't know other than just the gross names of it, well, you got this little singular cultus over here and this prefrontal cortex, blah, blah, blah. But you don't know the genes that are involved. You don't know the chemistry that's involved in all of that and the developmental biology of how that forms in the embryo and how things kick in and mutations change regulations that cause one feature to get bigger and another one to get less developed. They didn't know that stuff prior to the 1980s on. But when you look over in the anti-evolution literature, that cognitive area is one that is almost invisible in their discussion. They bump into it very, very peripherally. If they were having troubles dealing with the reptile-mammal transition, woo, cognitive technical literature is even more obscure. There's so much of it available that Jackson and I are going to be practically banging our heads against the wall to see how much of it we can leave out because we'll want to put in so much stuff because it's just such a vast array of material that has developed, and also the range of paleontology that's available in terms of that and the ecological circumstances of things. There's just a hell of a lot of material. I have on my own end a whole table full, stacked about yay high, of stack after stack of the material that I had accumulated for the human evolution issue for the Old Troubles in Paradise project. And then we'll be culling through that material and sorting stuff out to see how we want to relate that to the process of figuring out how that we had evolved at all, and then expanding the issues to the kinds of things we deal with today. So the issues that were obsessive for people in the Piltdown era, did brains come first before bipedality, and is it an either or kind of a thing, are significantly less relevant today. For example, our Neanderthals, that you had just a few skeletons available and that was it. Now we literally have Neanderthal DNA, and we have a range of Neanderthals from juveniles all the way to adults, and geographical range over time, so that we can look at things like the suture systems that are occurring in the skull, the tooth eruption patterns, and which thing molar shapes or what, and ferret out some of the genetic information that actually is relevant to those sorts of things. That would have been unbelievable even 30 years ago. And now, wow, they're dealing with it spectacularly. And guess what? That stuff tends to get bypassed in the anti-evolution literature. If they mention the papers at all, it's to push them aside in exactly the same way that Nathaniel Jeanson did that paper on bats, where in the book, he just flips it off, doesn't discuss its content. Ooh, he cited it. Yeah, big deal. And that case applies in virtually all of these other issues. So, oh, yes, that's, yeah, that's another point that from a methods direction that I'm really dedicated to try to present, is that a generality doesn't mean diddly squat if you can't give a specific. And specifics don't mean diddly squat unless you can connect them up to see general principles involved well, this doesn't really mean that, but this could mean that. And if you can't apply it to specific instances, then the generality is practically useless. And anti-evolutionism is full of lots of that. Now let's drop another shoe. If the methodology of creationism is functionally indistinguishable from the methodology of flat Earth, or the methodology of moon landing hoax believers, or the methodology of Holocaust deniers, or the methodology of anti-vaxxers, or the methodology of Trump voters, then maybe we're seeing a cognitive thing going on here that is independent of those dynamics. And the mechanisms that you would use to counter any one of them would have to be applied in the same case. And bearing in mind that and I bump into enough of them that I would say that the average Trump voter and the average young earth creationist and the average flat earther are all comparably, absolutely trench digging certain that they're right. And try to get them to trip over to the data field and apply their model that they don't actually have and get past the little meme pics they stick up and evaluate the reliability of the sources, if you can get them to even give sources. Those are the same methodological principles. And Functionally, they were what I was learning in college as to how you were approaching how historians dealt with things, whether it was Carlyle or Gibbon back in the 18th and 19th centuries, to deal with the same points of issue today as to how do we know what was going on with the sinking of the Titanic, or what do we know about the military policies of the Lincoln administration and its relationship to whether or not scorched earth policies in invading the South would be good or not, blah, blah, blah. All of those are the same application of the same point. That's great. Yes. Creation science is as accurate as saying a Concorde jet is a Model T auto. Yes, with worse, that creation science is a Model T car that doesn't actually have a transmission in it. And it's just sitting there up on wheel chocks because they've also taken the wheels off. And instead, they just occasionally put scenery up behind the car, running by really fast and say, see how fast this thing can go? No. And that's why the creationism movement hasn't moved an inch. That's why the intelligent design movement has made no progress. If you look back at the infamous wedge argument, and you can Google the thing and find out all the background information on it, which was developed in the late 1990s, they were anticipating a revolution as they were presenting their fabulous evidence, and the scientific community would just accept, unless they were like Richard Dawkins, blinded by their atheism, that they would go, oh, of course, Jesus. And that's how Philip Jeanson, and I think probably Steve Meyer, still envisages that kind of a thing today, except we're 20 some years down the road and the big revolution hasn't happened. So either they have to just kind of shake their heads and go, oh, they're just dogmatists and they just won't listen. They just refuse to look, or go conspiracy thinking that they are preventing this stuff from being seen. No, I've been looking at it all this time. I've been saying, please go ahead. So one of my yes, they're throwing shade at the C design propentiists. Yes, for those of you who don't know the joke there, that was the typographical error that popped up in the Dover hearings about the earlier versions of Pandas and People, because it started out a full-blown creation science book, and then after the legal rulings that said, can't teach creationism in the schools, it's religion, that suddenly they just text replaced intelligent design instead of creation science, except in one case they didn't get the correction correct, as anybody who's done cut and paste will know, and it came up C design propentiists. And that was a smoking gun about the transformation of this. Barbara Forrest did an enormous amount of work because they subpoenaed the earlier versions of this thing as it was mutating over time from the 1980s into the 2000s. And the 92 version of which by that time was becoming intelligent designy. Steve Meyer contributed to it. Michael Behe slipped in the stuff on blood clotting sequences and stuff. I think pretty much came from Michael Behe. And but still underlying it functionally was a creation science mentality. We can also see that the campaign that the ideas had when it started out, that they were going to show those silly creationists the proper way to do it, because they are a bunch of academics from various collegiate environments. They come from Oxford and Cambridge and Berkeley and all the rest, and see, they got proper PhDs, and they're the adults in the room, and they'll persuade these creationists, to mend their ways. Well, boy, that didn't happen. And indeed, if you look at the demographics and the structure of things, intelligent design is shrinking into a niche market where, yeah, they have little conferences. They have stuff in Bolsonaro's Brazil. They've had things over in Italy. They've had translations of their various works appear in Poland and other places where there's a conservative religious market that eats that stuff up. But boy, hot on their tails, you've got AIG and the dwindling ICR running in the same mode. And the vast majority of the creationist apologetics comes from young earth creationists. And a gigantic proportion of that comes from Answers in Genesis, with ICR as the little back pimple, which connects the dots then around to the fact that some of them were in Spokane this weekend. And the point I was making in my discussion of that meeting, which I did not see, I'm only going by what they've written in their other text. I'm not going to shell out any money to. They've apparently taken little kids on field trips and do all sorts of things to present the viewpoints to them. And I'm sure the graphics will be wonderful, and they'll be very, very confident, and they'll be very, very gentle, and they'll have a smug self-assurance, and they'll be smiling and pleasant and all that entirely. But it will have absolutely no effect outside that meeting. And if those people in there believe it, and they try to present that material outside to some annoying fellow like me, I'm going to be going, oh, really? Shall we go into the details of that? I'm happy to do that. Or there may be some there who are not Tortugan minds and will be kind of mulling this stuff over, and they may start investigating all of this on their own. And so how many of the people at these various conventions and meetings end up staying creationists in spite of all of that is an interesting thing, which really nobody has actually queried enough. We do know that a lot of the demographic is older farts like me. And so as the population changes demographically, the number of those doctrinal young earth creationists is starting to slip as a proportion of the population. Oh, yeah, that's... I think AIG should be monitored for fraudulent content. A lot of the published stuff is just outright wrong to the point of criminality. Yeah, it's... a lot of it is very cagily framed. I would say, from my own study over the years, the vast majority of anti-evolutionist apologetics is deck stacking. So they'll say we're dealing with the same information, but just from a non-naturalist biblical perspective. So they can basically theoretically accept scads of information, but there are clear instances. We documented quite a few of them in book 1, and we'll be putting more of that in book 2, of things where creationists actively are either dull as a sack of hammers, or they've misrepresented the source material because it was right under their nose. They had to literally take the sentence out that made the context change. And that happens with practically every anti-evolutionist that I've ever seen, not just the young earth creationists. You find it with Casey Luskin. You find it with Steve Meyer. You found it with Michael Behe, with Philip Jeanson, right down the road. And the same methodology is occurring because they so much want this to be true. And if you have the tiny little cluster of honest creationists, Todd Wood falls into that category, even though he makes a lot of statements where I'm going, really, Todd? Really? Kurt Wise is another one. They know enough about the data field to not make the kinds of overtly stupid sorts of things that you'll find in Kent Hovind land. But always, they've still got the need to make the big cartoon still fit. And so at the source level, it's when you're looking to see where they're starting to fuzz up the stuff. The claim that's made where there suddenly isn't a footnote because they don't have a reference for it. The claim where they're opening up a can of worms where they go, is that really true? You get so much of the stuff about the mega sequences and that Clary puts across, and John Morris and others, the supposed vast landscapes of stuff all laid down like frosting on a cake all at the same time. And in fact, it represents a layer of a landscape of which over time in all these different locations around the thing, the landscape is forming. It's not all happening all in one big lump. You'll only find out what's going on that when you start looking at the source data level. And plus, from an entertainment knowledge point of view, you'll learn a lot of stuff. Absolutely fascinating. And I defy anybody to take any creationist publication and compare it to its non-creationist counterpart and be impressed by it. If you look at Michael Ord and John Woodmarapp and Clary and John Morris and that on their books on geological and creationist geology, and compare that with even one bloody lecture from Nick Zentner over at Central Washington University in my neck of the woods that does the geology courses on our region will be alluding to a pile of that. He's, bless his heart, he's been doing videos of the various lectures for his courses for years now. And so they're available online on YouTube. And I will put Nick Zentner in here. If you aren't following his stuff on YouTube, do it. And the ones that are connected up to the college level courses actually link up to a syllabus which is publicly accessible. So they would be just talking about all these little technical papers. And rather than putting the links in the video description, he just has the master link to their website. And then you can download all of those papers. And I've downloaded them. We mentioned a bit about the Pacific Northwest because of the Columbia basalts and the Missoula floods in Volume 1, and we'll be doing some more of that on Volume 2 as a follow-up. But one of the spectacular features that has come about from following up all of Nick Zentner's material on the exotic terrains in the Pacific Northwest, the formation of the Cascades and the stuff that's part of the old red sandstone that's gotten sucked over, and the Baja BC material from up in Mexico, that the geology of the Pacific Northwest is like the mother lode. We're not spectacular so much on fossils. We have some fossils from various periods, but it's the geology that people come literally from all around the world to the Pacific Northwest because it's got everything. It's got the flood basalts. It has exotic terrains. It has complicated faulting systems and the bits about working out paleo environments and stuff that used to exist out in the Pacific Ocean that have got it accreted in here that aren't preserved anywhere else. It's absolutely delightful. And all of that material is so informative and fascinating compared to the claptrap that you get with Tim Clary and others that I go, no, they're not even closely comparable. Yeah. Yeah, Nick does stuff, of course, during the, it depends on what the seasons he does in the off-season stuff. He'll go out and go you on little field trips. He's done interviews with some of the various older geologists who he reminisces, and they bring out the backgrounds of how controversies developed and what work they had done in particular areas. And it's just absolutely delightful. And he's also has a theatrical background. So there's a panache and a descriptive flair that he has that I'm not nearly as clever as he is on things. I still can never think of the Columbia basalt apart from the way he describes it, which is the German chocolate cake and then the crinkle cut French fries and then the Tootsie Rolls, because the main body of the Grand Ronde is a very thick and solid German chocolate cake goop that's very resilient. And that's one of the reasons why all the Missoula floods that came along, they would hit the Grand Ronde and they would stop. So all of the valleys in the Grand Coulees only go down to the Grand Ronde pretty much. And then the stuff up above the crinkle cut French fries have this wavy quality about them. That's some of the upper deposits, and they're not nearly as thick as Grand Ronde. And then the Tootsie Rolls look just like little squiggles of Tootsie Rolls up there. And that's some of the most recent material that's up on the top of the layer cake. Those deposits went over many, many millions of years. I think about 14 million years ago or so for most of them in there. And recent work within the last 10 or 15 years has connected it up with the Yellowstone hotspot. That it's looking pretty much that hotspot, as the land masses have moved over it, one of the early phases of that was spurting off a sidebar that produced the Columbia basalt. All of this, try finding anything at that level of detail in creationist apologetics from Andrew Snelling, Woodmap, Ord, or any of them. Just, I dare you. And the same thing goes for people who are genetic experts, Dan Stern Cardinale and all the rest that teach it for a living. Joel Duff teaches biology for a living with a real live PhD. So they're able to spot the falsehoods and misrepresentations on the biological and genetic end in the same way that a geologist or astrophysicist or others should do. And so that's why the more who can get involved in this source methods game to explain and elucidate stuff to combat stupid, and it's fun. It's exciting. How can anybody look at this material and not become incredibly amazed at how extraordinarily fascinating the fields are and how much we've learned compared to what was known 50, 60 years ago, back when I was a little tot? Oh, wow, there have been revolutions in things. And the fact that so much of it is easily accessible, downloadable. Click, whoop, get the PDF. So that, I think, covers a lot of the continuing refrain of why I'm involved in this, why I think it's important. Bad methods have bad consequences. When people with bad methods get in charge of governments, which they do now and then, happened here, it's happening in a lot of countries in Europe. It's, I would classify the most dictators run off of bad Tortugan methodology. It's doctrinal, and they can kill you for it. The people that are rising up in Iran are an exemplar of people who just want to live their lives the way they want to and not be told by a bunch of old mullahs how they're supposed to do stuff. Oh, yeah, Bill, he was one of the best at showing AIG geology to be crapola. Yes, Bill Ludlow, I think. I just had started watching him when he fell ill. And so I wasn't able to see. Another thing that he was doing was interviewing ex-creationists. And Dapper Dino and others have kind of picked up that side of things, because it's always fascinating to do documentation on the thought process. I am atypical. I came from functionally a non-believer family. I never had any creationism to give up. But Dapper Dino came from that creationist background. Erica Gutsick Gibbon came from that. Quite a few people had their young earth creationist phases. They were raised in it, or some of them had a time coming into it. Some get into it in college for a while. There's a wide range of things about it. And that, for believers, is connecting up with the whole aesthetic about how they're dealing with the and all of that. None of that's applying. I came at it purely from a secular person who was going, yeah, this flood thing doesn't sound very convincing. I don't think that's going to cut it. And that was way back in the 1980s when that was the high point in young earth creationist apologetics, because they had enough people in legislatures and others that they would be putting legislation in place to teach creationism in the schools, and that got struck down by the Supreme Court. Which, here's a thing that I don't know that this is ever going to happen, but given the ruling that Dobbs overturned Roe v. Wade precedent, the precedent for the anti-creationism thing is more recent than Roe v. Wade. And Scalia, the hyper-conservative, wrote a dissent that was not dissimilar to the dissent that Alito wrote on the Roe v. Wade bit that got dusted off with Alito still on the court for the Dobbs ruling. Is there anything in principle to say that the Trump court couldn't get something down the road 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, even if there's never any other Republican presidents, where some little state group rams through, as Arkansas and various other things, there's always people there to put in anti-evolution legislation. It happens over and over and over again. And to try to challenge the Edwards v. Aguilar decision from the 1980s. I can't say that they wouldn't do that. What's on the agenda here? So this is why all of his, yes, Pelagia was a young earth creationist growing up, yes, and he's actually quite recent. I mean, I think he had his epiphanies and changes within just the last 10 or 15 years or less. So I was asking pesky, Mom sent all of us kids to Sunday school just so that we would be exposed to it. If we wanted to become religious, fine. If not, no problem. And I was the one who actually got in a little trouble for it, because I was asking, I'm a big dinosaur collector as a kid, my little dinosaur models, and I was reading the encyclopedia about it and all of that. And I would be asking them about dinosaurs in the Ark. And the poor little guy there in Sunday school actually had to call my mom and say, do not bring Jimmy back next Sunday. No, we don't want him. And he actually had said to me, you aren't supposed to ask questions like that here. And I'm going, excuse me, Sunday school? School is where you ask questions. What do you mean I can't ask questions? So this was the attitude that I had, even if, oh, yes, I think if it's just as gets a ticket, you might be problematic in that direction. Yeah. It wouldn't surprise me at all, because you have to remember, and this is an issue that annoys me about coverage of the current political environment. We do know that there is a divide between conservative evangelicals, who tend to be much more prone to be hyper-conservative Trump supporters and believe in conspiracy thinking and favor anti-vax positions and so forth, and also be creationists. All we have to do, and this is something that we're alluding to in various points in the various works, but eventually I'm going to do a much more detailed analysis, probably in the Big Culture Camp book, way down the road after we finish up a bunch of things. But the one to remember is Tony Perkins. I will put that up so that everybody can see that right on the video. Tony Perkins. This guy's a young earth creationist, still active, Family Research Council. You can Google him and get a lot of the connections. And the National Council on Policy, I think it's called, that funneled a huge number of people into the Trump administration at the administrative level. So they acted as a staffing agency. That the reach of that wackaloon, young earth creationist, hyper-ideologue, anti-abortion, anti-modernity, don't like gay rights, there's a whole laundry list of stuff that you can see at the Family Research Council. That's why they were so delighted with the Trump administration, and they would love to see more of that. Yeah, the 50 years ago, I would have called him a KKK proponent. There's an awful lot of connections up in there, too. The Ku Klux Klan was always anti-evolution. They've also were virulently anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic. Now, that element is less common and less favorable in at least the upper level of the Trumpista rhino Republicans today. Farther down, where the place they don't look, Christian nationalists, there's an enormous range of anti-Semitism. And you still find among the diehard young earth creationists, heavily Protestant, and they regard Catholicism as the whore of Babylon. You find the same thing still as a doctrine over in Seventh-day Adventists and that bunch, which is the group that helped found young earth creationism in the early 20th century. So it's a fascinating historical bouillabaisse and things that go on. But a great deal of the policy decisions that are being made by these rhino Trumpistas is completely consistent with the worldview of Tony Perkins. And that scares the bejabbers out of me, and it ought to scare the bejabbers out of anybody who thinks we really should have like civilization and progress, and they're not going to be helping any on it. So on that really upbeat, delightful mode, we just about hit a whole hour without any problems on the signal. Everything worked out really, really nicely on there. I'll be putting the links in to those cute little bat papers in due course. And everybody stay safe and try to avoid plague and troubles, and register to vote. Make sure that everyone you know registers and votes, even if there are things put in. We have an easy system here. It's vote by mail. Drop it off at the little vote, thing up at the library. Easy peasy. Check to see at the website whether or not it's been received yet. Blah, blah, blah. It's all comfortable. But so many places have too many complications that want to make it difficult to get out and vote. So that means you're going to have to prepare more to do that. But these elections matter, really matter, and make absolutely no bones about it to people that the things that we do and the people that get elected at local levels and for state senators and for secretaries of state, the people that control the election mechanisms, all of these, there are really loonies that are running for these things. Carrie Lake running for governor of Arizona, and theoretically an election could be stolen if you have enough of them able to tinker enough electoral votes, even though I can't see any circumstances under which Trump could ever win a popular vote. He managed to get 10 million more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016, but Biden got even way more. So, but still, that means you have to have turnout. And it's up to us, kids. Nobody else is going to do it. So stay safe, everybody, and see you next week. And do not accept wooden penguins, not even aluminum penguins. I will go beyond wooden penguins. Okay, bye.